To love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all of the burnt offerings and sacrifices we could ever make. To love your neighbor as yourself is more important than any kind of sacrifice, any kind of offering, anything else we could ever do. Our founder, Ernest Holmes, has a whole section in the Science of Mind textbook about teachings from the New Testament. And he says this: the two great commandments are to love God and all other beings. On these hang the law and of the prophets. Love is the complete unity with life. And we cannot enter this state unless we are in unity with all that lives, for all is one. To love God alone is not enough, for this would exclude your fellow beings. And to love humankind alone is not sufficient, for this would be a too limited concept of God. Love thy neighbor. So who is our neighbor? Who is our neighbor? To understand the answer to that question, we have to get to a clear understanding of what our own spiritual identity is. Who we are, in order to understand who our neighbor is. In his book, Practicing the Presence, Joel Goldsmith has an entire chapter entitled Love Thy Neighbor. And in there he talks about this idea of spiritual identity. This idea of spiritual identity is so all-encompassing. We limit ourselves when we think that God is a certain thing. And we limit ourselves when we think we are a certain thing. And we limit ourselves when we think rocks are a certain thing. When we miss the point that we're all interconnected, we are limiting ourselves in lots of different ways. Joel says, when we say, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, we are not speaking of human love, affection, or friendliness, but we are holding our neighbor in high spiritual identity. And then we see the effect of this right identification in the human picture. When we see our neighbor as that which is in and of God, then we are loving our neighbor. Whether our neighbor appears to be a friend, a relative, an enemy, a flower, a plant, or a stone. Our neighbor is all of this because we are all of this. There is a unity of life that transcends any particular form. We call this philosophy, this religious philosophy, panentheism, where God is in everything, but God is not contained and limited to one particular form. It encompasses all of it. In fact, it transcends all form. This is the idea of panentheism, is what the philosophers call it. In our principles, our Declaration of Principles, these are 10 statements of what we believe. Our Ernest Holmes wrote these back in the early 30s to give a succinct idea of what it is we believe in. And 3 of those 10 statements speak directly to this, that there is only one out there, one power, one presence, one divine creative source of all. Spirit manifests itself in, through, and as all creation, but it's not absorbed by its creation. In other words, it's more than any one particular thing. Another one says that we are all individualizations of that one Spirit. No matter how we show up, no matter what form it is, no matter whether it's animate or inanimate, we are all one individualized expression of that one Spirit. And then a third one talks about the unity of all life. I think even using the word life might be limiting in some ways, because it transcends all of that. If we get ourselves down to that molecular level, there is very little difference between the molecules in each one of us. In fact, in this room here, if we talk about it in a DNA point of view, 99.7% of every single one of us is exactly the same. How much do we spend focusing on that 0.3% though? We spend all of our energy, time and time and time, throughout history, throughout all of creation here. We've spent time focusing on that 0.3% and not the 99.7%. We look at the differences. That's part of our human nature, is to look at differences It's a way that we keep ourselves safe. And it's been developed over many, many eons of time to group ourselves in like groups because there's a sense of security and safety in that. But that's not the way we're meant to be. We're not meant to be focusing on that 0.3%. We're meant to be focusing on the 99.7%. Finding all of those commonalities that we have within each person to bring that about. So this idea of loving our neighbor, the first thing we have to do is get clear on who our neighbor is. It's not just the person sitting next to you. It's not just the person down the street. It's not just the person that you work with. It is everyone. And it transcends even humans into other forms of life too. Imagine what it would be like if we could treat all life as if it was one.
Keeping it real with Reverend Laura.